Optimizing the aviation supply chain. This is another area where there is huge opportunity. Essentially, we need to have material to service the aeroplane. We need to have spares and we need to have material. That material costs money. If we don't have enough, we're going to pay premium rates to get what we need. If we have too much, first of all, we need storage space, and secondly, we are locking in capital for this material that we may not be using. So when we talk about optimizing, it's having the right amount of material available when we need it. So the more understanding we have regarding our material needs, the better. So for example, routine. The routine maintenance requires a certain amount of parts. For example, filters, O-rings, engine oil, hydraulic oil. So consumables and parts. And we're going to need these. And we can calculate based on how many hours we're operating the aircraft, how many aircraft, we know how many maintenance visits. And so we know what our usage rate is. So the next thing to look at is, what is the cost? If I buy more, they are considerably cheaper. So I've got to now balance. So who is doing that? It needs to be done within the organisation. The next thing to look at is the parts that we take off the aeroplane. What are we going to do with them? Well, depends on how many we've got. What does that mean? Well, sometimes you find people have scrapped an aeroplane for its parts, and there is sometimes more money in scrapping an aeroplane for its parts than in maintaining the aeroplane. At a certain point, and aeroplanes go through a cycle. They typically go through a 5-year cycle. You get a brand new aeroplane on a 60-month lease. And during that 60 months, you will pay a monthly lease rate. For example, some years ago, brand new 747-400 came in round about 180 million US dollars. It's more expensive now, and of course, the 380 is probably up to about 300 million dollars. But the monthly lease was 1.4 million US dollars. So that means at the end of 5 years, you've paid 60 payments of $1.4 million. If you do the math, that gives you $85.5 million. Typically, you've paid about 50% of the initial value of the aeroplane. You've paid. Now, the aeroplane's 5 years old, so its value is no longer $170 million. It's maybe $110 million, for example. And so you renegotiate another lease, and instead of $1.4 million, you're paying $985,000 a month. And that carries on for the next 60 months, for example. However, your maintenance costs have increased. And that's the background to understanding the supply chain. We know we're going to need certain material. As the aeroplane gets older, we will need more material. So we need to factor that in. And we need to balance it and make the right decisions. Again, all of this information can be managed, can be organised, and we can make the best decisions. Now, the second lease means the aeroplane is now 10 years old. And typically, what happens, it goes for a third lease. Means the aeroplane's 15 years old. However, a number of companies at the end of the second lease have been dismantling the aeroplane, taking the engines off, the APU, the components, the avionics, and scrapping the airframe, because it's actually of more value by selling all the parts. And it's a balance. If you can imagine, one of the reasons that became advantageous is because of the requirement for the spares. If you flood the market with spares, the price collapses, and so the whole thing is a balance. This is, again, a business model. What you've got to decide is how to manage the spare parts. If you're working with customer aeroplanes, it's a different story. You do not have that option. If you're an airline, you have a stores full of components. And managing these components is a task in itself. Optimizing, and an example, if I have $10 million worth of spares on the shelf, that doesn't actually cost me $10 million. Why? Because I borrowed $10 million against the spares. How much interest do I pay? Well, let's say I pay 8%. So against that $10 million, I'm paying $800,000 a year. So my 10 million spares is costing me 800,000. If I can reduce that 10 million spares to 5 million, actually I'm 400,000 better off, because I only have to borrow now 5 million. And that's the background. Managers of supply chain are challenged when it comes to awareness of future needs. This obliges them to default to reactive behaviour. What does reactive behaviour mean? They make decisions based on the information that they've got, which inhibits opportunities to develop cost-saving strategies. Organisations which do not have an effective understanding of the supply chain are forced into knee-jerk solutions which involve deliver at far higher cost. For example, a repetitive AOG purchase. If the organisation is able to take control of the supply chain, they can reap significant benefits by developing appropriate stock level and reorder levels, by reducing the downtime waiting for parts and materials. Typically, everyone accepts the need for improvements to the supply chain. However, the multiple challenges are not given sufficient visibility, and sometimes there's a lack of data. And we have an expression that we use. This is an English expression. And we talk about the behaviour of an organisation, and we say they're behaving like the fire brigade. How do the fire brigade behave? Well, they sit there. They wait. They wait until the bell. Ding, 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 ding. And then they're all in full action. There's a fire. Where's the fire? And organisations behave like this. They behave waiting for something, and then it's a crisis, and everything's a crisis. And everybody says, we're too busy. Of course you're too busy. You're too busy fighting the fires, because every day there is some more fires. What we've got to do is we've got to get hold of this story, and we've got to prevent all these little crises. How do we do this? By the process, the procedures, and when you see it working in a very, very effective way, everything calms down. And a good example is to look at the way the Germans work. The Germans, they do not work any harder than anybody else, but they pay very much attention to the effectiveness of the process and the procedures. Look at the German auto industry. BMW, Audi, Volkswagen, Porsche, Mercedes. How come these guys are sweeping the world? Because when you go and look at the German auto worker, he's not working any harder. He's just working more correctly, more accurately. And it's the same in businesses. We can look at that and we can do that. We can do that in every business.